The night of March 14th, 1943, is moonless over occupied France. Somewhere above the Dordogne Valley, a four-engine Halifax bomber moves through the darkness at barely 500 feet above the trees. Its engines do not roar in triumph. They murmur low and heavy through the black air, held back just enough to keep the aircraft steady, just enough to keep it alive. Inside the fuselage, no one speaks. The crew know this kind of silence. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of men who understand that one mistake, one wrong heading, one flare of searchlight, one German night fighter appearing from the dark, can turn the entire aircraft into fire before anyone has time to pray. Near the open hole in the floor, the dispatcher crouches beside the red light fixed to the bulkhead. Cold air tears through the aircraft. Below him, the black fields of France slide past like shadows underwater. A river flashes once in the darkness. A village appears for a moment, blacked out and silent, then disappears behind them. There are 4 passengers in the back of the aircraft. Not soldiers in the usual sense. 2 are women. One is barely 20 years old. They wear civilian clothes beneath their flying gear. In their pockets are forged identity papers, ration cards, coded addresses, and small pieces of a false life they have memorized so completely that even under torture they must not hesitate. Each of them has a name tonight. A false name. Each has a story, a birthplace, a reason for being where they should not be. And in less than 1 minute, they will fall through the hole in the Halifax floor and vanish into Nazi-occupied Europe. This is not a bombing raid. There are no bombs aboard. The aircraft carries no industrial target, no city, no railway yard, no factory marked on a navigator's chart. Its target is darkness itself. Its mission is officially deniable, deliberately hidden inside the machinery of secret war. The Halifax is carrying agents of the Special Operations Executive into France, where they will join resistance networks, organize sabotage, transmit intelligence, and, if they are lucky, survive long enough to matter. Many will not. The aircraft that makes this possible is not remembered the way the Lancaster is remembered. It never became a national myth like the Spitfire. It was not sleek, glamorous, or loved by poster artists. But on hundreds of nights across the war, it was the Handley Page Halifax that carried the secret war into the heart of occupied Europe. It carried agents, weapons, explosives, radio sets, forged documents, money, and hope, all through a single simple modification, a hole cut into the floor. To understand why the Halifax became so important, you have to return to the summer of 1940. France had fallen. Belgium and the Netherlands were occupied. The Channel Islands were under German control. Britain stood alone, battered but not broken, and Winston Churchill wanted more than defense. He wanted Europe set on fire from within. In July 1940, the Special Operations Executive was created with a mission unlike anything in conventional military planning. It would train agents, build resistance networks, supply partisans, sabotage factories, bridges, trains, power stations, communications lines. It would turn occupied Europe into a battlefield behind the battlefield. But from its first days, SOE faced one enormous practical problem. How do you move people into countries sealed off by enemy armies? How do you deliver weapons to men hiding in forests? How do you send radio equipment to a woman living under a false name in Paris? How do you get explosives, money, codes, and trained agents into a continent watched by the Gestapo? The answer was the air. But in 1940, Britain did not yet have the right aircraft for the job. At first, SOE used what it could get. The Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, an aging medium bomber already slipping out of frontline service, was pressed into special duties work. It could fly at night. It could carry small loads. It could be modified, but it was slow. Its range was limited. Its ceiling was poor in bad weather. And for agents, its drop opening was cramped, awkward, and dangerous. Men and women leaving the aircraft could strike the fuselage. Parachutes could catch badly in the slipstream. A frightened agent might freeze at the edge, and the dispatcher had only seconds to act before the drop zone disappeared beneath them. Secret war demanded precision. The Whitley offered improvisation. SOE needed something larger, stronger, longer-ranged, and more adaptable. The answer arrived in the form of the Handley Page Halifax. The Halifax entered RAF service in 1941 as a heavy bomber. It had been designed for Bomber Command's campaign against Germany, not for dropping spies into moonlit fields. It was a serious machine, more than 21 meters long, a wingspan of roughly 31 meters. For engines, a maximum loaded weight in later versions of more than 29,000 kilograms. It could carry thousands of kilograms of bombs over long distances and return through darkness, flak, weather, and enemy fighters. But for SOE, its greatest value was not the bomb load. It was space, range, strength, and adaptability. Engineers removed equipment from the lower fuselage and created a circular opening roughly 76 centimeters wide. Around it, they fitted a padded rim. The cover could be opened by the dispatcher at the exact moment of release. SOE called its agents Joes, regardless of gender or nationality. So the opening became known as the Joe hole. It was not comfortable. It was not elegant. But it worked. An agent would sit on the edge, feet hanging into the slipstream, elbows tucked tight, parachute line clipped in place. Red light. Wait. Green light. Fall. And then the aircraft would move on, leaving the human being behind to become someone else in the darkness below. The Halifax could also carry supply containers. Long cylindrical metal tubes packed with Sten guns, explosives, ammunition, radio sets, medicine, clothing, forged papers, and currency. A single aircraft could deliver enough material to keep an entire resistance circuit alive for weeks. Later missions used electronic navigation aids such as Rebecca and Eureka, allowing crews to home in on beacons operated by reception committees on the ground. But technology never removed the danger. The aircraft still had to fly alone. At night, low over enemy territory, often between 300 and 700 feet above the ground during the final drop. At that altitude, a Halifax was vulnerable to everything. Light anti-aircraft guns, small arms, searchlights, night fighters, bad weather, hills, trees, navigation errors. One mistake could kill everyone aboard. And still they went. The heart of these operations was RAF Tempsford in Bedfordshire. From the air, it was deliberately made to look ordinary, almost rural, like a harmless working farm rather than one of the most secret airfields in Britain. Agents prepared for departure at Gibraltar Farm, where they changed into civilian clothes, checked forged papers, received final instructions, and stepped fully into their cover identities. They were driven to the aircraft in darkness. Introductions were brief. First names only, often not even real ones. The Halifax crews knew almost nothing about their passengers. They knew they were carrying agents. They did not know their missions, their real names, their networks, their chances of survival. Operational security demanded ignorance, and the crews accepted that ignorance without complaint. They had their own work to do. Fly the route, find the field, avoid the fighters, drop the agents, return before dawn. That was enough. Now return to the Halifax over the Dordogne. The red light still burns. The dispatcher looks back at the 4 passengers. One by one, they move toward the hole. The first agent sits on the rim, legs already swallowed by the black air beneath the aircraft. The slipstream pulls at his clothes. The dispatcher grips his shoulder, waiting for the navigator's final correction. The aircraft banks slightly. Below, somewhere in a dark field, resistance members are holding torches in the agreed pattern. If the pattern is wrong, the aircraft must not drop. If the field is compromised, the agents may land into a trap. If the navigator is off by only a few kilometers, they may land across a river, in a forest, or near a German patrol. The margin for error is not generous. It is almost non-existent. The red light snaps to green. The dispatcher gives the signal. The first agent disappears. Then the second. Then the third. Then the fourth. For lives fall into occupied France. The dispatcher closes the cover. The Halifax banks north. Its engines deepen. The crew begin the long, cold return toward England. The navigators of RAF Tempsford were considered among the finest in the Royal Air Force. They had to be. Ordinary bomber crews flew toward cities, factories, rail yards, industrial districts large enough to burn visibly from miles away. The crews of No. 138 Squadron RAF and No. 161 Squadron RAF hunted something far smaller. A single dark field in occupied Europe, sometimes marked only by 3 torches arranged in a coded pattern, sometimes surrounded by German patrols, sometimes compromised before the aircraft even arrived. and the Halifax crews had to find it in darkness while flying low enough to smell with smoke from villages below. The operations launched from RAF Tempsford existed under a level of secrecy extraordinary even by wartime standards. Tempsford itself had been deliberately disguised from the air to resemble ordinary farmland. Buildings near the perimeter looked agricultural rather than military. The barns stored weapons, parachutes, radios, forged papers, and supply containers for the Special Operations Executive. Nothing about the place was meant to attract attention. That invisibility mattered, because the men and women departing from Tempsford were not simply aircrew. They were ghosts preparing to enter Europe. Inside Gibraltar Farm, agents changed into civilian clothes before departure. French jackets, Dutch shoes, Belgian identity papers, a wedding ring chosen to match a false biography. Every detail mattered. An SOE agent could survive interrogation only if their invented life became more real than their actual one. They memorized addresses they had never visited, family histories that did not exist, childhood stories belonging to imaginary people. Some practiced signatures repeatedly until their forged identities became instinctive. Others carried tiny cyanide capsules hidden in buttons or coat linings. Not everyone intended to be captured alive. The Halifax crews themselves were deliberately kept ignorant. Operational security demanded compartmentalization so strict it could appear cold. Pilots rarely knew the true identities of their passengers. Dispatchers often learned only first names. Navigators received coordinates, not mission details. The fewer people who knew the full structure of an operation, the smaller the damage if someone was captured. So the crews concentrated on practical matters instead. Fuel consumption, wind correction, German radar coverage, cloud base, engine temperatures, drop timing, survival. The flights themselves were extraordinarily dangerous. A Halifax on special duties operations usually flew alone rather than inside the massive bomber streams crossing Germany. That isolation reduced visibility but also removed protection. No nearby aircraft, no defensive concentration, no confusion of targets for German night fighters. Just one heavy bomber alone over occupied Europe. And unlike strategic bombers operating at high altitude, the Halifax crews often descended to between 300 and 700 feet during the final approach to the drop zone. At that altitude, the Earth itself became dangerous. Church towers, power lines, hills, trees, fog, entire mountains emerging suddenly from darkness. Flying low at night across occupied Europe demanded astonishing navigational precision. The crews crossed terrain including the Alps, the Pyrenees, the river valleys of central France, the forests of Poland, and the mountains of Yugoslavia. And still they were expected to locate a single isolated field identified only by coded torch patterns held by resistance members below. The margin for error was terrifyingly small. A drop zone 2 kilometers east of the correct location could place agents into German hands. A field beside the wrong river might strand an entire resistance network without supplies. A navigational mistake lasting only seconds could destroy months of preparation. And yet again and again, the Halifax crews found their targets. The Rebecca Eureka navigation system introduced during later operations improved accuracy dramatically. Resistance teams on the ground operated Eureka beacons, while the Halifax carried Rebecca receivers capable of homing toward the signal. Compared to the primitive navigation methods of 1940, the technology felt almost miraculous. But electronics never removed the human element. A navigator still needed extraordinary judgment. Radio signals reflected strangely in valleys. Weather distorted calculations. German jamming remained a threat. And the aircraft still had to descend low enough for visual confirmation before dispatching agents into darkness. Machines could help, but ultimately a human being still decided when the green light turned on. The Halifax carried more than people. Its modified bomb bay often held cylindrical supply containers roughly 1.5 meters long and packed with weapons, ammunition, explosives, medical supplies, forged documents, wireless equipment, or money. A single aircraft could carry 12 such containers, enough to sustain an entire resistance circuit operating near collapse. A radio set delivered into occupied France could connect London directly to sabotage teams hundreds of kilometers behind German lines. A few containers of plastic explosives could cripple rail movement across an entire region. The strategic effect of these deliveries frequently exceeded that of much larger bombing operations. A destroyed railway junction repaired in days mattered less than resistance sabotage repeated constantly over months. The scale of the operations gradually became enormous. Between 1941 and 1945, the Tempsford squadrons flew thousands of sorties across occupied Europe. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Italy, Greece, Denmark. Almost every occupied country eventually received agents or supplies delivered through the Halifax network. The precise numbers remain difficult to establish because many records were deliberately obscured or remain partially classified even decades later. But post-war estimates suggest that No. 138 Squadron RAF alone flew approximately 2,500 operational sorties. Hundreds of agents entered Europe this way. Tens of thousands of supply containers followed them. The human cost remained severe. Aircraft disappeared into weather and never returned. Others were destroyed by German night fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Mechanical failure over occupied Europe at low altitude usually meant death. A Halifax could absorb astonishing punishment compared to many aircraft of its era, but there are limits beyond which no machine can continue flying, and the crews flew constantly at those limits. The German response evolved as the war continued. Initially, the Luftwaffe focused primarily on Bomber Command's large strategic raids. Small individual aircraft operating independently were difficult to detect. But by 1943, German radar systems and night fighter coordination had improved dramatically. Special duties aircraft increasingly faced interception. Some Halifax crews carried Monica tail warning radar designed to detect approaching fighters. Unfortunately, the system could also betray the aircraft's position to German detectors. Technology in war often solves one problem by creating another. The comparison with German covert air operations reveals how unusual the British system truly was. Germany operated its own Special Duties Organization, KG-200, which used aircraft including captured Allied planes for infiltration and espionage missions. But Germany never created anything comparable to the institutional structure surrounding Britain's secret air war. The British built dedicated squadrons, dedicated training facilities, dedicated logistics networks, dedicated drop zone coordination systems, an entire invisible air force supporting invisible armies across occupied Europe. The Americans eventually learned from this system through cooperation between SOE and the American OSS. Later American Special Duties Squadrons operating B-24 Liberators in the Mediterranean carried out similar missions. The Liberator possessed greater range than the Halifax. But many American crews acknowledged that the Halifax handled low-level night flying far better in the confined terrain of European drop zones. Its responsiveness at low altitude saved lives repeatedly. The strategic value of the Halifax operations cannot easily be measured through conventional military statistics. The aircraft did not destroy factories directly. It did not flatten cities. Its contribution emerged through thousands of smaller effects accumulating invisibly across occupied Europe. A railway sabotage operation delaying German reinforcements by 48 hours. A wireless transmission revealing troop movements before D-Day. A resistance network surviving winter because containers filled with food and radios landed successfully in a frozen field. These outcomes rarely produce dramatic battlefield photographs, but together they shaped the war profoundly. And every one of them began with a Halifax climbing into darkness from Bedfordshire, carrying people whose real names often vanished the moment the aircraft crossed the channel. The psychological effect of the Halifax operations on German occupation forces was far greater than most German commanders initially understood. The Wehrmacht and the Gestapo increasingly realized that occupied Europe contained something they could never fully eliminate. A hidden army constantly replenished from the sky. Weapons appeared where none should exist. Radio operators emerged suddenly in villages thought secure. Sabotage teams destroyed rail lines hundreds of kilometers from active front lines. Resistance networks reappeared after being dismantled. Again and again, German authorities discovered that occupation itself had become unstable because every night aircraft crossed the channel carrying more agents, More radios, more explosives, more hope. The darkness had become a supply route, and Germany never fully solved how to close it. The Halifax crews rarely knew the true identities of the people they carried. They knew only weights, fuel loads, headings, timings, and drop zones. But history eventually revealed some of the names that passed through the Joe hole into occupied Europe. Violette Szabo flew into France aboard a Halifax during her second mission in June 1944. She would later be captured, tortured by the Gestapo, and executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp in February 1945. Noor Inayat Khan, the first female wireless operator sent into occupied France, departed from Tempsford aboard a Halifax in June 1943. She maintained radio contact with London under extraordinarily dangerous conditions before betrayal led to her arrest. She was executed at Dachau concentration camp in September 1944. The aircraft carrying these women into darkness did not know their futures. It knew only altitude, heading, fuel consumption, and the green light that sent human beings into occupied Europe. There is something deeply haunting about the routine nature of these flights. At Gibraltar Farm, departures were logged. Estimated return times were written down carefully. Aircraft took off. Agents disappeared into the continent. If the Halifax failed to return, another crew would eventually replace it. Another sortie would be prepared. Another group of agents would wait in silence beside the Joe hole while England disappeared behind them. The secret war depended on repetition, night after night, month after month, year after year, until Europe itself seemed threaded together by invisible aerial corridors crossing the darkness. The Halifax represented a strange bridge between conventional warfare and clandestine operations. It had been designed originally for one purpose: delivering bombs against industrial targets deep inside Germany. Nothing in its early design suggested espionage, resistance networks, or covert insertion missions. Yet the aircraft adapted almost perfectly to a role its designers had never imagined. And remarkably, the transformation required no revolutionary breakthrough, no entirely new aircraft, no experimental propulsion system, only practical modifications: a hole cut into the floor, a padded rim, additional fuel tanks, a modified bomb bay, and crews willing to fly alone through darkness at terrifyingly low altitudes over enemy territory. That simplicity is part of what makes the story extraordinary. The Halifax was never glamorous. It lacked the sleek elegance of the Supermarine Spitfire. It never acquired the mythic public identity of the Avro Lancaster. It was not the fastest bomber of the war, nor the highest flying, nor the most heavily armed. But it possessed qualities uniquely valuable for the secret air war: reliability, range, payload capacity, adaptability, and endurance. The aircraft could absorb remarkable punishment and continue flying. It could carry heavy loads across enormous distances through darkness and weather that grounded lesser aircraft. In the business of dropping human beings into occupied countries and hoping they survived the landing and everything afterward, those qualities mattered more than glamour ever could. Every successful resistance circuit in occupied Europe depended upon supply. A radio operator without batteries became useless. Saboteurs without explosives became observers rather than fighters. Resistance groups without money, forged papers, medicine, or weapons slowly collapsed under pressure from occupation authorities. The Halifax sustained these networks physically. Every intelligence report reaching London from occupied France. Every railway demolition delaying German troop movements. Every resistance ambush. Every hidden wireless transmission warning Allied planners about enemy deployments. All of it began with a heavy bomber climbing out of Bedfordshire into the night. The strategic economy of these operations was remarkable. A single sabotage mission supplied through Halifax operations could delay German reinforcements more effectively than large-scale bombing raids costing dozens of aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. Destroying one critical rail junction at the correct moment sometimes mattered more than flattening entire industrial districts. SOE understood this deeply. The organization specialized in precision disruption rather than mass destruction, and the Halifax became the delivery system for that philosophy. The German military struggled to counter this kind of warfare because it existed outside traditional military logic. An army can defend against tanks, against bombers, against naval blockade, But how do you fully suppress a resistance movement supplied unpredictably from the sky? How do you secure every field in France, every valley in Yugoslavia, every isolated farm in Poland? The Germans committed enormous resources to anti-partisan operations, internal security forces, rail protection, checkpoints, intelligence networks, and counter-espionage. And still the aircraft kept coming. One Halifax alone in the darkness, carrying containers and agents into occupied Europe, represented something psychologically corrosive to the occupation itself. Proof that Germany never truly controlled the night. Several Halifax aircraft from the Special Duties era survive today in museums and collections. The Royal Air Force Museum Cosford preserves part of a Halifax fuselage, while a largely complete aircraft survives at the Yorkshire Air Museum, itself located on a former wartime bomber station. Visitors standing beside the aircraft today often notice its size first. The long wings, the thick fuselage, the sheer physical scale of the machine. But the most important feature aboard many Special Duties Halifaxes was astonishingly small. A circular opening in the floor barely wide enough for a frightened human being carrying a parachute and a false identity. History sometimes turns on surprisingly modest pieces of engineering. Return now one final time to the Dordogne Valley in March 1943. The green light burns inside the aircraft. The dispatcher signals. One agent disappears through the hole into black air. Then another. Then another. Then another. Below them waits occupied Europe. The dispatcher closes the hatch. The Halifax banks northward and begins climbing slowly back toward England while the crew calculate fuel, heading corrections, and weather across the channel. At Gibraltar Farm, their departure has already been recorded. If they do not return before dawn, another line will eventually be added to the records. Another crew will prepare for the next mission. The war continues. What the Halifax ultimately represented was not simply transportation. It was connection, a bridge between Britain and the hidden resistance movements scattered across occupied Europe. It carried not only supplies and agents, but continuity itself, the assurance that resistance fighters hiding in forests, cellars, farms, and ruined cities had not been abandoned. The Halifax did not win the war alone. No aircraft could claim that. But it enabled a form of warfare Germany never fully understood and never completely defeated. Every successful resistance operation, every intelligence report transmitted from behind enemy lines, every act of sabotage delaying German forces, every hidden radio still transmitting after midnight. All of them began the same way. A four-engine bomber climbing into darkness from Bedfordshire, crossing the channel alone, descending low over occupied Europe, and opening a hole in its floor above a pattern of torches held by people risking everything for the possibility of liberation. The Halifax carried the war into the darkness and left it there burning quietly until dawn.